Hello, you are very welcome to joining us for today's Econ Paul Annual Conference 2020, obviously being hosted online. And I would like to welcome new attendees who are joining us for this final panel debate, a live discussion on the US election. What impact for the EU, US and Asia trade relations? It's a huge topic, so I hope we will get lots of input from our audience. As always, you can use the Q&A function, which is in the bottom of your screen, to ask your questions, and we will do our best to answer them in the next hour and a half. Please do keep your questions concise. If they are for a specific panelist, please say so. If they're for the whole panel, please indicate that as well. Now, I'm going to introduce you to our speakers. We're very pleased to have with us Anna Ashton, Senior Director for Government Affairs at the US-China Business Council. We have Rüdiger Bachmann, Professor of Economics at the University of Notre Dame. Lisandra Flach, Director of the IFO Institute Center for International Economics. And Mary Kasperek, Executive Director, Institute of International Economic Law at Georgetown Law and Non-Resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. So I'm going to give you all the opportunity to broadly answer the topic of our discussion this afternoon. And that way we will get a little bit of background about you and understand the perspective you're coming from. So first of all, Anna, let me start with you then. What will be the impact of the US election on international trade?
So I think obviously a great question, and a lot remains to be seen. But let me start by just briefly saying I work for the US-China Business Council, which is a trade association that represents American companies that do business in China. And so that is the perspective from which I'm looking at these issues. Biden has repeatedly expressed an intention to be tough on China. He did so throughout the election, but he also repeatedly indicated an intention to take a more measured approach to the relationship. And to some extent, Biden's rhetoric during the campaign was dictated by domestic politics. We should expect him to pursue, I think, a more measured approach, a fundamental aspect of which will be seeking multilateral cooperation. He was repeatedly emphasizing the need to work more closely with our counterparts in Europe and elsewhere, and to re-engage and reassume a leadership role and a responsible role in various international institutions. He will attempt, I think, a hard reset of the Trump administration's unilateral approach, at least that aspect of the approach to China, but I also think he'll be constrained by domestic pressures. Americans right now strongly associate China with the health and economic consequences of the COVID pandemic, and our public attitudes towards China have actually hit a 15-year low. There was a recent Pew study that found that 72% of Americans hold a negative view of China. That's 20% higher than it was just 4 years ago. So that need for a rethink and a recalibration of China policy is partly driven by strong domestic views that our relationship with China is unfair and unbalanced. But it's also one of the few things that Democrats and Republicans in Congress agree on. Congress is remarkably motivated to pass China legislation. Right now, there are 489 bills and resolutions that have been proposed in this Congress, which is just that are China related, and that's a staggering amount. To put it in perspective, after September 11th, 2001, there were 130 bills and resolutions proposed in Congress that had some sort of counter-terror elements to them. So, the angst and concern over China is that much bigger than the angst and concern in America after 9/11 over terrorism. A fair amount of this legislation that's been proposed is protectionist and could have spillover effects on trade relations with Europe, and that could complicate Biden's effort to restore transatlantic trust and cooperation. And then finally, how effectively China is pursuing multilateral cooperation is another issue that Biden will have to contend with as he is trying to rebuild his relationships, or the United States relationships, with the world and come to some sort of cooperative approach to address the challenges that China presents. China is promoting its own rules and norms internationally, which is perfectly within its rights and understandable, but they're not necessarily always compatible with the free trade and open market approach that the United States has traditionally stood behind, that Europe has traditionally stood behind. And they just concluded negotiations on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the largest trading bloc globally, covering a market of 2.2 billion people and 26.2 trillion of global output. So we're not members of RCEP. We're also not members of the newer version of the TPP, the CPTPP. And we may be in a position where we're losing our influence in the Asia Pacific and need to find a way to rebuild it. So that multilateral effort that Biden has pledged to undertake will be really important and hopefully successful.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, thank you. I want to turn now to Rüdiger to get your similar thoughts on the same point, just a general overview of how you see the situation. We'll get into the nitty-gritty in due course.
Yeah, thank you, first of all, for having me, and it's a pleasure to be on a panel with such really distinguished trade experts, which I really am not, actually. So I'm here, the general economist, and someone politically interested in the United States. As such, I want to start with the first point, that the election isn't over yet in the United States, and I think this is an important point. And by that, I don't necessarily mean that there's still an outside chance that Trump's outlandish schemes in the courts will come to fruition, which I increasingly believe they won't. But I mean by that is the Senate. The Senate is very much up in the air, and this is sort of, I think this is a bit underappreciated, because normally one would think, how can local elections, regional elections in one U.S. state be somehow important for international trade? But, they're important for a whole lot of things, because it's the control of the Senate and therefore the unified control of government that hangs in the balance in January in Georgia. And until we know how that is going to go, I think we don't know an awful lot, actually. Especially since, and this is especially important for trade, is that the TPA, the trade, which is a sort of an authorization, right? Sort of the modern trade agreements, they're not actually sort of negotiated in the form of constitutional trade treaties, the way it's was done traditionally, where the Senate has advice and consent with a 2/3 majority and stuff like that, but rather sort of through executive action, which the United States president is authorized to do, but there's also a sunset clause on that authorization, which is coming up next June, okay? And so whether that will be reauthorized or not, who knows how that is going to go. And it's not just Georgia, because I also think, and I fully agree with Anna, that there's some strong protectionist tendencies also in the Democrats, and it's totally unclear what that would mean. In fact, independent senators like Bernie Sanders, for example, have voted against these authorizations in the past. So it's not even clear that a full control of government would reauthorize these authorities for the president in the United States. And that means that, sort of how much hamstrung the Biden administration will be in their trade policies is very much up in the air, again, together with the Georgia elections, but even without them, because it's a little bit unclear where these various sort of intra-Republican, and so in other words, whether on trade you're more free trade or more populist, sort of goes a little bit orthogonal to your party affiliation, right? They're Republican free traders, Democrat free traders, and in both parties quite the opposite. So how that shakes up, and then in particular how, for example, somewhat independent senators like Mitt Romney, who I think would be in principle more of a free trader kind of guy, whether he would be feel more free to sort of leave party discipline on certain things should Mitch McConnell be the majority leader going forward. This is all very much up in the air. So I would say a lot of uncertainty is still going on. So that's sort of my first big point. For Europeans, the second point I want to make, in a sense, there's quite rightly a lot of relief in Europe about a Biden presidency should it come, and everything looks like it will come. But I think my thesis is that if anything, it's going to be tougher, right? Because there will be much more of a put up or shut up kind kind of attitude towards the European from the Biden administration, because as Anna said, there will be much more multilateralism. Biden wants to work with the with international, sort of in a multilateral way, with international organizations. But that also means, and I think this is important, and Europe really needs to understand this. If Biden does that, he needs to show something quickly. Okay, we basically through given the United States sort of political makeup and of institutions, there's an extreme short-termism in U.S. policy, because we have House elections every 2 years. So 2022 is already looming large, and the Democrats, with having to do with the redistricting that's now after the 2020 census is coming up, are going to be afraid for their lives in the House. They have barely managed to hold on to the House. And it's going to be super hard to get anything done here for the Biden administration, should Congress, as far as Congress is needed in trade negotiations. So Europe should, so in other words, this multilateral approach has to deliver quickly for Biden, and it has to deliver in a way that he can credibly say, and congressmen and women in their districts can credibly say, we got actually something out of this for the American worker and for the American voter. And I'm somewhat pessimistic that this is even possible, given how slow these things work. So, but you know, we have a little bit more time for the presidency, which is 4 years. But even that seems like a short time. And if Europe, you know, wants to prevent another, relapse into a Trump-style protectionism, who knows? Trump might be running again in 2024. So they have to deliver. Otherwise, this multilateral approach is going to crumble, because it doesn't get many more chances. That's, I think, in the U.S. I think that's for sure. You can already hear people on the right-wing media agitating against sort of the return of the swamp. In their lingo, the swamp is basically multilateralists. They call them globalists, people who want to work with the world. And they're already sort of, heating up the propaganda machine against that approach. And Biden hasn't even been sworn in. And so Biden will have to show quickly that it works. And that means Europe might have to, if they want to help him, which is not clear that they want, I think they should. But anyway, if they want to help him, they have to deliver quickly, and a big dose of populism has to be granted for the United States. Otherwise, Biden and the Democrats will not survive this politically. Two smaller points, and then I will shut up for a bit. I think the issue, especially with Europe, of international trade is also connected with the issue of international taxation. Right. So the reform of international taxation. The Europeans want a lot from the United States, right? And sort of giving up the taxation of Amazon and other sort of digital giants. I think, and maybe there's an opportunity here, right? Might be an opening. If they really want the United States to give up something there, they have to deliver even more in trade. Okay, and protectionist policies in Europe will have to go. Otherwise, Biden will not be able to show success, political success. Last point. The good news is, though, that now adults are back in the room, and I think that shouldn't be underestimated. The Biden administration, and I'm sure we don't know who the Secretary of Commerce will be. At least I don't. Some rumors about Andrew Yang, but anyway, or the United States trade representative, that hasn't been announced. But the cabinet picks and the administrative level picks that Biden has made so far are of extraordinary quality. These are really, really smart people. They know what they're doing. They are not Peter Navarro and Larry Kudlow, who are basically clowns, media personalities made in given power. And so that's a good thing. So, adults are in the room, and for Europe and for China. And so negotiations should in principle work. Rational people should be able to find some common ground. But again, it needs to be done fast.
Thank you, Rüdiger. We'll come back to some of those points to expand on them a bit further. Lisandra, let me turn to you and ask for your opening thoughts, broadly setting out what your perspective is.
Okay, so thank you very much, Anna and Rudi, for these inspiring insights already in this introduction round. So, yeah, I think, a lot of it will depend on what Europe and US do in response to the election outcome. But in the sense, the election of President Biden means an opportunity, right, to realign relations and to reactivate trade talks for a transatlantic trade agreement, and to create more stability in the multilateral trading system and a more collaborative environment, right, in the yeah, and this is in big contrast to what has happened in trade policy in the U.S. in the last 4 years. So a lot has happened in the last 4 years under Trump. So it would also take time to reinstall trade relations. So the U.S. has lost some trust capital abroad. And but the election from Biden also provides some room for hope for multilateral organizations and for the future of WTO. And this is also in big contrast to Trump, that has a clear aversion to multilateral organizations. And so now I think the election from Biden provides some hope for reinstalling multilateral organizations and multilateral talks. But yeah, as has already been mentioned by Anna and also by Rudi, so it will not be less tough, because in a sense that Biden has also a protectionist agenda. So there is one sentence in the Democratic election platform which is very emblematic for that, and I like it a lot, which is it's written, for too long the global trading system has failed to keep its promises to American workers. And this seems like a sentence coming from Trump, but is in fact in the Democratic platform. So this shows that Biden also has a protectionist agenda. So also with the Buy America campaign, which already exists under Obama, and could create trade conflict. So I think a lot of it depends on how these policies will be implemented, right? And I think another important issue is that trade policy will be also competing with domestic market policies, which will have priority, right, in the Biden presidency. So, but something has to be done in terms of international relations, right? So otherwise, the U.S. and Europe will be lagging behind, let's say. So let's take the example of the RCEP, which Anna mentioned before. So the recent trade agreement between Asian Pacific nations, including China. So China has shown that it can join and can help set up a plurilateral trade agreement. So this should be also a wake-up call for the EU and the United States. So I think resetting and rebuilding the relationship with allies should be a priority of the government, and not only for the US, but should also be a priority for Europe.
Thank you, Lisandra. Finally, Marie, your thoughts on our topic today. Set out your stall and tell us what you agreed with and what you didn't agree with there in our other opening statements, and we'll get into the detail then.
Thank you so much. We've heard a lot of really good points already. So I'll add a few points and look forward to discussing in more detail in a little bit. You asked what is the impact of the U.S. elections on what I call the trade triangle, the U.S., the EU, Asia. The short answer is the tone and approach will be different, but the objective will largely be the same: to rein in China's trade practices. To me, I would call it a mix of Trump's and Obama's policy on China. So what that means is President-elect Biden will still be tough on China, but there will be less unilateral action and more of a mix of bilateral, trilateral, as well as multilateral approaches. Like Lisandra has said already, and the other panelists, with all of this, it is really, really important to keep in mind that everything will have to be viewed through a domestic lens. No foreign policy issue has more bipartisan support than getting tough on China, but we do have what I call the pandemic effect. What I mean by that is that the focus of the Biden-Harris campaign was to build back better, combined with a general continuation of protectionist policies. Everything just has to be viewed through a domestic lens. The focus will be on fixing the domestic economy first before we can expect any move towards trade deals or any significant engagement abroad. However, and that's I would say where maybe I differ a little bit with the other. Well, maybe not. I don't differ from Rudy in that, but maybe a little bit with Lisandra is that we. I love the phrase "you have to chew gum while you walk." It's an American idiom, and you basically just don't have the luxury to focus exclusively on domestic policy and then just later on move to engage with other countries on trade deals or otherwise. So you kind of have to do everything in parallel. Let me just really briefly dive into these three levels: the bilateral, the trilateral, and the multilateral. Because in order to understand the US's elections impact on this trade triangle between the US, EU, and China, it is really important to dissect the US's bilateral relationship with China and the EU respectively. I would say on US-China, there are expected areas of continuation, such as the stance on Huawei. There will be no really immediate action on tariffs. There won't just be rolled back immediately. There will be a continued approach and tough sanctions on government entities that are involved in human rights abuses. The areas of change, I would say, are largely centered around one of the centerpieces of the Biden administration, that the values are emphasized, values on democracy and also multilateral approaches. There are areas of potential US cooperation, for example, climate change, public health, maybe even the denuclearization of North Korea. But what about trade? So not to go into too much detail here, but I think that President-elect Biden will not just nix the Phase 1 agreement, but will be keen on building on it rather quickly, focusing on resolving structural issues in a Phase 2 agreement. Moving on to the other bilateral level, the US-EU, really briefly, my bottom line here is we're not going to go back anywhere to where we were before the Trump presidency. And several disputes have to be resolved. Again, they can happen. This resolution of those disputes, such as Airbus-Boeing conflict, rolling back the tariffs, the digital service tax, and the carbon border adjustment tax, to name but a few, can happen in parallel with engaging on, so, for example, China and WTO reform, but they will have to be resolved and they will not just go away with the Biden administration. And another opportunity, I would say, is to engage in what I call the next gen trade issues, digital trade, COVID-related matters, e-commerce, environmental goods agreement, and maybe the healthcare area. And just really briefly on the transatlantic engagement on China, the Biden administration will likely continue the newly established bilateral dialogue on China with the EU, as well as the trilateral with the EU and Japan. What I would mention here, though, is that it's important to keep in mind Europe's relationship with China and how that might impact its ability and willingness to really, really be super tough on China. China is the EU's second largest trading partner. The EU is China's biggest trading partner. Some European countries, such as Italy, are heavily invested economically in China through the BRI and otherwise. So Europe will be really keen on maintaining good relations with both the United States and China, and not just choose between them. Which brings me to my last level of US engagement with China. Really briefly, we have mentioned the WTO, so I will not go into that much. But the other one is the TPP. I know one of the, I think Lisandra had mentioned this before. President-elect Biden could rejoin TPP, or she mentioned RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that was signed earlier this month. So it is really important that the new U.S. administration will find a way to reassert the U.S.'s place in the Pacific Rim's economic future. And how we could get there concretely, I'm happy to elaborate on in a little bit. To summarize, I think regarding the election's impact on the trade triangle, that is the EU, US, China, I would say that while the diagnosis is the same, the treatment will be different.
Thank you for that analogy, Marie. Now, let me start really with you. You suggested that Europe might feel in some way obligated to help Biden get these sort of quick victories that he perhaps needs post-Trump administration. How much of that feeling do you think from an EU side might be a backlash against Trump? And then furthermore, do you think there might not, I mean, although you've said it's going to be a harsher presidency than we expect in Europe, do you think there might be a sense that early on in his presidency, Biden will see the low-hanging fruit in Europe as a way to bolster him before taking on China?
I think that's possible, right? I mean, so if you just look at the superficial things point to that, right? The fact that his pick of Secretary of State, right, is sort of someone who speaks French fluently, apparently, right? And John Kerry is a Francophile, right? And so there seems to be, even just from the personnel, some. But again, I really want to hammer this point home, and this is important into China. Biden needs to demonstrate that this new approach basically delivers the same or better results than Trump has delivered for the American worker and for those people in the upcoming battleground states, and for those congressmen in flip districts, in purple districts, right? And if that is not going to happen, it's unclear that Europe should do this. It's not clear, though. I mean, obviously, Europe's objective shouldn't necessarily be to maximize Biden's chances of re-election. They should maximize the welfare of Europeans. But my point is, there's an obvious tension here, right? So, again, I think this is really important. The Biden administration will expect a tougher policy from the EU on China. There's no question about that. And he needs to be able to point to say, look, multilateral approaches work just because there is such a big anti-China sentiment in the United States across the board, across the aisle. He needs to be able to show, look, with multilateralism, we can actually increase the pressure on China and can get things done. And if that doesn't happen, I fear that he will, first of all, the Democrats will Congress quickly. They might lose it anyway, frankly. I mean, it just doesn't look good. But he will also, I think, hurt his chances of his own re-election, or whoever his successor might be, presumably Kamala Harris's chances in 2024. And then who knows? I mean, this is speculation right now.
We're a long way from 2024.
I mean, it depends a little bit on where the GOP will go, right? Will the GOP stay the party of Trump? Will Trump stay a party leader, or will there be some sort of movement to the middle, right, with a still populist but less aggressive leader in the Republican Party? I mean, that we all don't know, but I wouldn't take it lightly that Trump would run again and might even win again. And so, if I were Europe, I would be, and I think it is in the interest of Europe, quite frankly. I'm less of a multilateralist in the sense that I do think that China has some problematic trade practices. And I think it's about time that the EU, stands up to this and understands sort of where in the value structure of the world it wants to be. Whether it wants does it? I mean, there has been a lot of talk in the EU that the United States under Trump has left sort of the value structure of the West. And Biden will return that question now in some sense, especially on China, right? And will say, where are you on that value structure? Are you going to go with us and be tough on China, or are you going to be waffling and cater to some dictators, the way the EU has accused Trump of doing so, and quite correctly of doing so. So I think that will be really important, and I think it's a tough decision for the EU to go. I mean, I know where I would like the EU to go, but I think just as a matter of facts, I think this will be some unpleasant conversations the EU will have to have, and quickly so.
Okay, I think we'll let the poor man get sworn in before we start looking at his successor, certainly from the point of view of today's discussion. Also, speaking from Brussels and the capital of Europe, the idea that John Kerry's able to speak French is somehow an amazing feat, is not really winning over too many EU leaders who, of course, are probably more concerned about who speaks Chinese within the administration. And on that, Anna, let me ask you, is there a sense in which the EU may be overlooked because the Biden administration feels it has bigger fish to fry with China?
Oh, I really don't think so. I actually think that the EU will be critical to a Biden administration strategy for addressing challenges with China. I agree absolutely with Marie that fundamentally the goals of the Biden administration will not be so different from what we've seen with the Trump administration, with the caveat that I don't think that the Trump administration actually had very clear goals articulated other than make the trade relationship fair, and didn't really have a strategy other than, continue to engage in this trade negotiation and pile on tariffs when China didn't give us what we wanted. But overall, the Trump administration attitude to China was aggressive and about rebalancing. And I think the Biden administration will also be aggressively pursuing a rebalancing, or at least a reconfiguration of our relationship with China, because we're in a new era where China is far more economically powerful than it was when it joined the WTO. Its military is not remotely the size of ours, but is certainly the second largest in the world and growing. There are some well-founded concerns about China's intentions and whether or not its economic approach to trade and commerce is fully compatible with Western approaches, and whether or not its strategic priorities are compatible with ours. And the fundamental way that the Biden administration we know will differ from the Trump administration is their recognition that the United States is simply not big enough or powerful enough on its own relative to China at this point to take it on unilaterally, to address these problems unilaterally. And it must have partners. And the EU has an awful lot of common ground with the United States and its relationship with China. As tough as the talk from the United States has been on China, we too have a very important relationship with the Chinese. They're a very important trading partner for us. They need to remain an important trading partner if we're going to revive our economy, and if we're going to have the kind of revenue in our tech industry to remain on the cutting edge and be able to compete technologically with them. So it's sort of a catch-22 of wanting to protect all of our intellectual property and make sure that it can't be stolen or misappropriated, but at the same time needing that commerce in order to fuel the investment in research and development. I think this is very similar to Europe's orientation to China, and Biden will want very much to prioritize rebuilding relations with Europe in order to then turn to addressing China together.
As a follow-up question, you mentioned Europe's approach to China. Is there a sense that Europe's not singing from the same hymn sheet? We have a somewhat fragmented approach, certainly in terms of, you mentioned tech policy. We see different countries going their own way with regard to use of Huawei equipment. We see different countries embracing the Belt and Road campaign, and there's a difference. And do you think that weakens the EU's position, that we're not as unified as sometimes we should pretend to be?
I don't. I think that on both the Belt and Road Initiative and on the question of Huawei being able to participate in infrastructure, these are issues that I think the Trump administration has sometimes sounded has often sounded very decisive about and very certain of. And there are others among US policymakers and elected officials who also have pretty clear-cut rhetoric on these issues. But the truth of the matter is that they are more complicated issues than I think meets the eye in typical American discourse. And there will be a lot of sorting through exactly what kind of technological engagement can we have with China and what is threatening. What kind of, investment in the world and offers to fund infrastructure development, et cetera, are things that we should support China pursuing because it's ultimately good for global economic development, and what kinds of things do we want to discourage countries from accepting from China because they are taking advantage of them. I think actually there's a lot to be sorted out here, and there's a lot of education that needs to happen among policymakers in the United States, and it's not a bad thing that there's not a single consensus view on this in Europe, because it will help foster a more meaningful conversation about how to address those things.
Lisandra and Marie, we've mentioned once or twice already the tech sphere, and it's a little bit my baby, so I do want to ask the question on it. Accusations against Europe for being protectionist when it comes to regulating big, which are predominantly US tech firms, predates the Trump administration. There was accusations that Margaret Vestager was out to bash America with some of the rulings and antitrust rulings we saw in the EU. To what extent do you think the tone of these sorts of debates will change under the Biden administration? Will they be more conciliatory, or will there be a sort of a more measured approach? Or do you see the EU just continuing the current path of saying it's not about the fact that you're US, it's about the fact that we're doing this regulation? Lisandra, perhaps, or Marie, you can go first. Thanks, Marie, please.
Thanks. I think it's something that definitely we will need to watch and continue watching, especially because there is a deadline in January on resolving the digital service tax dispute between the US and France. If that is not resolved by January 6th, we could see still under the Trump administration, we could still see tariffs coming up. And counter tariffs, so that could be an unwelcome last surprise from the Trump administration as a gift for the Europeans and vice versa. But I think to your question of if we will see a change, I think maybe a slight one, just because there is some domestic pushback from the Democratic Party as well. On the tech giants. We have a recent case against Google that we are looking at as well domestically. But generally, the issue will definitely remain, and it would be important to look at it from the OECD level as well. I would hope that there is some sort of resolution, but right now it's still uncertain. So it is a really tricky issue that will probably remain tricky going forward.
Thank you. Lisandra, would you like to reflect specifically on that challenge?
Yeah, so I also believe that it will remain tricky. I think it's just a changing in tone, probably. And the election of Biden, as I mentioned in the beginning, it provides room for hope for multilateral organization and our WTO reform potentially, so which could include rules on digital trade. So, but this will remain a tricky issue. And yeah, so in general, some points on trade agreements. Now, as a general rule, so when negotiating new trade agreements, Biden will. But then we can discuss that later. So this was yeah, but. Or maybe.
Well, since you brought it up, let's go to a question from our audience.
Yeah, so, sorry?
Since you brought it up, I mean, we do have a question from an audience member saying, okay, do you think there could be a revival of the TTIP negotiations? Is that something you see?
Yeah, so as we know, so the fact that the US has withdrawn from TTIP, so from the Transatlantic Partnership, has maybe even given more impulse for the creation of RCEP, right? So for the trade agreement between the Asian Pacific countries. And I see this as a big mistake. So that the US has withdrawn from the trade agreement. So if Biden restarts conversations, this could also increase the US influence or restore the US influence in the Asian Pacific region. So I see this as this should be one of the policies that Biden should put forward. So to restart the conversations for a TPP agreement. Yeah, but I think so in a general sense regarding trade agreements. Definitely, Biden will put American workers, at the center of the attention. Right, in his campaign, he has mentioned that the primary goals of the agreements are to create jobs and increase wages. And yes, so Biden wants to restart conversations for transatlantic trade agreements, and also the EU and the US should definitely do that. But the Democratic in the Democratic Party platform, they also write that the US will not negotiate new trade agreements until they first invest at home and in the competitiveness of the US. So in that sense, this is what I wanted to say with this point, that domestic policies will be a priority. But I agree with Marie that the government, I mean, the US cannot, the government cannot take one problem at a time. So parallel to the domestic dimension, the president should start already in the first year to approach allies and to take the opportunity to realign international relations. But again, domestic policies and if this is taken as a priority, this could create tensions if nothing happens in terms of international relations.
Thank you. Another question in from an audience member, Christophe Ledel. I think, Rudy, you might be placed to answer this one. Many believe that Mr. Biden will raise tax rates. Would this mean that US firms will be back in other developing and developed countries? And will they again try to get tax privileges in Europe?
Yeah, again, I don't think that we can know right now, and because of the question of what's going on with the Senate, right? I mean, as long as Mitch McConnell is the majority leader, I don't see that Biden can do much in terms of taxes. His policy options will be more on the regulation side and stuff like that. But a tax policy, that's the power of the purse. That's with Congress, and I don't see that the Republicans will be going with that. It's unlikely. And even if the Democrats win the Georgia elections, the Democrats' majority in the Senate would be rather thin. We have a bunch of senators that are still very, very much centrist, or rather really Reagan Democrats, right? The senator of West Virginia, for example, the senator of Montana, the Democratic senator of Montana. People, if you look at, if you look at West Virginia as one of the reddest states in the country right now in the presidential election, but they still have a Democratic senator who won re-election actually in 2018 with a record that's basically close to a Trumpist type of record. So anyway, we need to. So I don't see it. The Senate is just not there for these kind of experiments. So I don't necessarily expect much. I think what's rather going to happen is there will be some push for Biden to actually consolidate, and I think so. but he's not going to get to doing it with tax increases. It will probably some kind of compromise in expenditure cuts after the crisis or something. Yeah, because of the exploding deficit in the United States. So I don't see tax increases as really part of a realistic policy option.
Anna, you wanted to add some thoughts on that as well, I think.
Thank you. So I actually wanted to add thoughts on both of the two questions. So on the first question about the prospects for TPP and TTIP, I think that is the ideal for the US and EU in addressing the challenges posed by China, is for us to come together in that way and be able to be promulgating similar standards and policies and putting them out as our version of what global trade and commerce should look like and how it should be done, and also leveraging our influence together in order to persuade other countries to do things our way. However, I also think that it is going to be a hard thing to bring to fruition because of the domestic politics that Rudy mentioned, and that Lisandra mentioned. You know, democratic domestic priorities are absolutely first before additional trade agreements. They have said that. And Rudy has talked about the Senate runoff and the extent to which it matters. And here I think that actually might be particularly important. I don't think that at the end of the day, US-China policy will be particularly different, whether there is a Republican-controlled Senate and Democratic-controlled House, or a Democratic-controlled Senate and Democratic-controlled House, because there's so much bipartisan agreement on China issues. But on trade more broadly, you know, Democrats have been very clear that they expect there to be more significant labor and environmental provisions in any future trade agreement. And Republicans may just not be willing to support that. So if we had a divided chambers, I could see Democrats in the House not being willing to approve anything that doesn't have those standards, and Republicans in the Senate not being willing to approve anything that does. So that could be a problem. And then on the question of taxes, I am not the tax expert, but I just wanted to add that I don't think that taxes in this particular situation are going to be the number one consideration for US businesses. I think they are so optimistic, hopeful about being able to welcome back stability and predictability in our trade relationships and in our trade relationship with China in particular, but not just China. And a first priority for them is going to be successfully persuading the Biden administration to roll back tariffs, some tariffs at the very least, certainly tariffs that have been levied on our closest trading partners. And then I think also there's the reality that reshoring pressures are very, very high for US companies right now, and that will counteract much of the drive that increased tax rate might create for them to take manufacturing and other operations elsewhere. In addition to that, not only are reshoring pressures high, but Congress is considering all kinds of subsidies and incentives to help US companies create and maintain operations at home. So I don't really see there being a mass exodus of US companies' operations from the United States in the event that Biden raises taxes.
Marie, your thoughts, please.
Thanks. I just wanted to briefly chime in on that first question that Lisandra got on TTIP, because I've been dealing with TTIP. It feels like a decade, but you know, from all the conversations on chlorinated chicken, it's never going out of style. But anyways, the short answer to if there is a chance for TTIP to come back under President-elect Biden, I just really do not think so. For the reasons that Lisandra and Anna have pointed out previously, but also TTIP was fraught with problems long before the Trump administration was in power, both on the U.S. side and mostly actually on the European side. So it you know, not to burst the EU bubble, but TTIP was not a big thing in the US at the time. It was, at that time, it was really more about TPP and Asia and not about the EU, because the EU was already considered such a good ally and partner that people were just, it was too boring to make the news in a sense, which is a good thing. I'm all about making trade boring again. But what I would say is there is chances for continuing on a limited scope that we've seen recently. We had this infamous lobster deal, which is hailed as some sort of like a small step into the right direction. We could see some more elimination of further tariffs on industrial goods. But the big issue here really is, from the US side especially, the disagreement on including agriculture. The US does not want to deal without agriculture, and it will not go through Congress without agriculture, and the EU will not include that. So I think that is a major disagreement that will prohibit us from making really any progress there. However, there are steps in the interim that we can do, to move towards a positive direction, such as resolving the Airbus-Boeing dispute in the short term. Questions on carbon border adjustment, I think, have a real chance under a Biden administration. Working together on climate change, the US will be back on the conversation on climate change, especially now that Secretary Kerry is designated to specifically deal with that area. That shows the commitment from the US side that they're really serious about that going forward. And another thing is what I mentioned before, the next gen trade issues the EU and the US can work together on. And from the domestic side as well, there's the problem that we mentioned, the TPA will run out in July. It is relatively unlikely that it will be renewed it will depend on how the Senate elections go going forward. But I just think it will be very difficult to conclude any actual trade agreement that would even resemble TTIP. There's no appetite for it, political appetite, and there's also just no window of opportunity at this point. With regards to TPP, really briefly, I saw in the chat that there was a question to me about, kind of countering China's influence in the Belt and Road Initiative. I think it kind of brings me back to my point that I made earlier on how President-elect Biden might consider rejoining TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that President Trump pulled out of on basically his first week, so to say, of its administration. Obviously, it's very politically charged. It was politically charged before, but I think if there's one thing that the U.S. administration of the past 4 years has taught us, is that there is a consensus on being tough on China, and TPP is just a really good avenue, plurilateral avenue to exert influence in the region and kind of have a counterbalance, and relatively easy counterbalance on China and not to be left behind. And concretely, maybe we could see a rebranding exercise, take a page out of Trump's rulebook there. I can't believe I'm saying this, but like he did with USMCA or NAFTA turning into USMCA, some sort of rebranding exercise and tweaking some of the provisions that are in TPP and rejoining it, removing investment protection provisions that were a big problem in the original TPP debate, find a way for new auto content rules in the USMCA that are tougher than those in TPP to continue. So I'll stop there, but I think that is one of the easier ways and kind of most immediate ways to counterbalance China for the new administration.
Thank you. We'll get a Make Trade Boring Again cap to you soon. Now, you also raised the issue of the chlorinated chicken, which is back in the headlines in the UK for reasons related to Brexit. So I do want to come on to that Brexit question and what extent do you think that may disrupt the EU-US relationship. Lisandra, would you like to take a hit at that?
Well, Brexit has already created a lot of uncertainty. It has already, created, we have seen since the referendum already big shifts, right, in terms of in the EU-UK relationship, and yeah, but I think with Biden, I would also see a changing in tone here. And so in this sense, this is an improvement to what we have observed by now. But I see, I'm very, I think the what we have seen now from, I'm sorry, can you?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes. I guess you've lost us, Lisandra. It must be your feed. Let me move on and send me a signal when you've got us back. Rudy, let me turn to you then. The same question, how do you see Brexit as muddying the waters in terms of the EU-US trade relationship?
I don't think I have a particular good insight, so I'd like to pass on the question, other than sort of agreeing with Marie that I just don't think that whole relationship, EU trade relationship, will be all that important to the Biden administration. Again, I think what they would want is a clear commitment to sort of stand up together for Western values against China. And things like that, and also, and I think this is another question in the chat, perhaps some progress, trilateral progress with China, the EU, and the US in terms of climate. I think that's where the trilateralism really will be important. But sort of the revival of sort of going back to these old days, I again don't see it. I mean, again, just because first of all, it's not high priority, but secondly, it will take too long again and the EU really would need to put up something, and as Marie said, it doesn't seem to be willing to put up for all its own talk on multilateralism and stuff like that. The point is, if you want to do multilateralism, and I really want to hammer on this point, if you want to do multilateralism, then at some point you'll also have to put up, and you have to compromise, and you have to give the others something, right? And the EU hasn't been great with that, whether that's maybe because of internal disagreement, or maybe because it likes to be a bit sanctimonious about things, but not actually sort of there's a lot of talk, but not don't sort of talk the talk, but not walk the walk. It's a bit unclear to me, but it's not that the EU has been sort of. There's a lot of sort of talk about multilateralism, but in terms of actual action, I don't think the EU has been a great champion of multilateralism in the world, and that will have to change if they really want it to work. Then they need to give something, Biden, and quickly. So what I think might happen is sort of informal feelings out of the Biden administration to sort of key EU officials, probably to Germany, to France, to see, what actually can we get done quickly, so that we have all sort of quick political successes on which we then can build to move towards China, and maybe to a more sort of elaborate renewal, TTIP, 2.0. But that is, if anything, a longer project. But in the short term, I fully agree with Marie. Anyway, the EU would have to change very radically for this to happen.
Well, we say it all the times in the EU Brexit negotiations that getting together all these 27 different leaders is a bit of a challenge, and it's a juggernaut, and it does not maneuver quickly. Lisandra, did you want to come back in? We lost you halfway through.
So I think, if you can hear me, that's very good. So so on the Brexit issue, so I think in general, I think that the United States and Europe need to be united in supporting and promoting the rules and norms for international institutions. Now, and in terms of trade agreements, and this then now comes to Brexit as well, I think a bit of pragmatism and less cherry picking is what is needed for the US and the EU. So if we take the example of Brexit, right, there is long-lasting Brexit negotiations. So if you see, we are discussing things like in the fishery sector, right, which are economically really not relevant, but politically very important, or the North Ireland question. But what we see is then this is a bit of cherry picking. So I think we should be more pragmatic on that. Also, if you look at the EU-Mercosur agreement, it was negotiated for 20 years, and it's now still waiting to be ratified, right? So I think we both the EU and the US need to be more pragmatic to advance in bilateral and multilateral negotiations. And I think the Brexit is a good example for that, on how not to conduct trade negotiations. Yeah.
I don't think we could say that the Northern Ireland issue is minor or cherry picking.
Yeah, okay, but it's a political, it's a political question, and I think a lot has been discussed on that, and then I think one needs to come to a conclusion at some point. So also, if you look at the Mercosur agreement, so it has been negotiated for 20 years, right? So for over 20 years, so that's my main take on that.
Please don't make me think about the prospect of 20 more years of Brexit. I just couldn't take it. We have a question, as Rudy alluded to already. It was on climate neutrality and China's climate neutrality target by 2060. We've got the EU ambition under the EU Green Deal. And Jan von Herf is suggesting that maybe there is some sort of deal to be done, a bit of multilateralism there. I mean, Marie, where do you think, or what do you think might happen, for example, with regards to the Paris Agreement?
Before I move into that, I just want to really give 2 cents or like a quick addition on the UK from a US perspective. I think just because we always also talk about processes, internal processes, we can't just look only on the political issues, which are obviously a huge obstacle. However, also procedurally, once the new Biden administration takes over, again, with TPA running out in July, what that means is that the incoming administration basically only has time to accept it mainly as it has been negotiated by the Trump administration, and then spend significant political capital to push it through, right? That is that no matter how important the US-UK relationship is, and I don't think that anybody in the new administration would dispute that, it is just enormous political capital that would have to be spent in the first, 3-4 months on this. And given that it always takes time for, USTR, Lighthizer, Ambassador Lighthizer, he only came in May. So in the new administration. So like it takes a few months to build that. And then for the people who are then there, they basically can only accept the deal as is, which has been done, but is very unlikely, especially given the political domestic climate right now, to focus on domestic issues. It is unlikely to push a major deal through in the first few months, especially because from the US point of view, we're also looking obviously how the negotiations are going between the EU and the UK. And it's hard to really imagine a deal from the US side without a significant market access to the British food market. However, if the EU and the UK are making a big deal on the food market and market access, then that obviously is kind of in conflict, like we said, with some of the food standards, such as the infamous chlorinated chicken, right? So there are some caveats to consider there, both procedurally, politically, but also procedurally with the EU and the UK. On your question with regards to climate change,
can I just quickly jump in before you go to
Certainly, yeah.
I kind of want to support this, and I would wager something even stronger. I don't think that the Biden administration basically cares for the UK. I just don't see this. I don't think this whole idea of a remaining special relationship between the UK. I mean, if the UK thinks that, I think they're completely deluding themselves. I mean, Biden is not gonna. I mean, Europe has to hope that they are still on the map, and I think they will be more than before, given the otherwise sort of more Pacific-oriented sort of a perspective of American foreign policy. But if the UK thinks that they're going to get any special treatment or anything, or that they're even on the map for the Biden administration, I think they're just kidding themselves. So nothing is going to happen there in that regard. There's no love, in particular, given the previous sort of allyship and friendship of so-called friendship between Boris Johnson and Trump. I just don't see that Biden gives a hoot about the UK. So I think the point is even stronger than Marie was making it. But I fully agree.
To echo that, as an Irish person in Brussels, that's certainly the feeling you see from the EU side. There's a certain feeling in Dublin that in Biden they have one of their own in the White House to an extent. And from the Dublin perspective, it's very much framed as Dublin against the Westminster elite, rather than necessarily the EU as a whole.
Yes.
Marie, to move on, because we are rapidly running out of time, let's go back to this climate change question and your brief predictions on that.
Yeah, I think I would keep it rather quick there, because climate change has been, and we've mentioned that previously, climate change has been a big issue for President-elect Biden. He nominated already somebody to deal with that, somebody who's very established, who had Secretary Kerry to deal with the issue, who's been recently in the past few years dealing with the issue in his current function. So he has appointed somebody credible in that post to deal with that. And already, right? USTR, we don't know who USTR will be. We don't know who is going to lead commerce. We know already who's going to lead climate. So that is, a big signal, which is needed because the US has lost all trust internationally on climate change, on other issues too, but on climate change particularly. So I think we will definitely see a rejoining, obviously, of the Paris Accord, but there will be tangible results that have to be delivered, such as rapidly accelerating emissions reduction policies. But generally, I think the tone is set. The tone is really set. And, from the US side, I think the Biden administration really hopes by setting the tone and signaling with appointing Secretary Kerry as like the climate czar or like the climate king. We really hope to reestablish trust of the international community that we are going to be a good partner on climate change.
Before I move on to what is probably the elephant in the room that we haven't really touched on too much, which is, of course, the COVID pandemic situation, let me briefly, Anna, ask you to comment on not a storm in a teacup, obviously, but a sort of a side issue with relation to Hong Kong and how damaging that has been for Chinese relationships, particularly with Europe, but also with the US. And I'm thinking, of the UK reaction, since we see these sort of side, if you like, bilateral arguments breaking out.
Sure. So, first of all, I think that it's already been mentioned that American ideals, such as standing up for human rights and promoting democracy, are going to be emphasized more, if anything, by the Biden administration than they have been by the Trump administration. We'll see more consistency there. So I don't think that U.S. pressure on China with regard to Hong Kong is going to let up. And I also think that we're going to see increased pressure on China with regard to Xinjiang, Uyghur forced labor and detention, and even numerous democratic proposed bills have mentioned Tibet and have proposed things like not allowing any more openings of Chinese consulates in the United States until there can be a consulate in Lhasa for the United States. So I think that on human rights and democracy broadly, not just with regard to Hong Kong, we're going to continue to see friction between the U.S. and China. Hong Kong is, I guess, the developments in U.S. policy toward Hong Kong are concerning from a business perspective, because the business community obviously wants to see Hong Kong continue to be a thriving democracy and economy. They're also worried that some of the punitive measures that the United States has imposed are going to come back and hit them. So for instance, one of the bills that Congress passed calls for secondary sanctions on financial institutions that do business with individuals who are targeted with sanctions for having undermined democracy in Hong Kong. We haven't seen a rollout of these secondary sanctions yet, partly because when the Trump administration announced that it was going to be enacting sanctions and I guess identifying individuals who had undermined democracy in Hong Kong, they seem to kind of do it in this ambiguous way that might not be connected to the legislation, might be independent of the legislation. But we may see that before the Trump administration leaves office. And that is a major concern, and it is causing especially financial services firms to have to grapple with whether or not they can maintain their presence in Hong Kong, which they certainly want to do over the long run. For many, many reasons, it makes sense. But if the relationship continues to unravel on this front, it may make less and less sense. I hope I got at what you were asking.
I think you did, yes. So as I mentioned, we haven't really talked too much about the impact of the pandemic, which is refreshing, but also not going to stand, because I'm going to ask that on my last sort of round of questions to you all. I'd just like you to reflect on what the pandemic has meant to the election, to the outcomes, and to the difficulties going forward. And feel free to indulge in thought experiments about what might have been the case had the pandemic not struck when it did. Lisandra, since I see you seem to have a good, strong connection now, let's go with you first while we can.
Okay, so yeah, I think so. Going back to this issue on domestic policies, so besides the domestic policies, then there is still the pandemic and the crisis to be dealt with. So this is definitely a challenge in the Biden presidency, and yeah, so in the relation of COVID and globalization, so not only in the U.S. but worldwide, the COVID has increased the skepsis, right, on globalization, and has boosted also these protectionist policies. So this is, but on the other hand, we have also observed in the data that protectionist policies do not work. So if we take the example of the phase one deal with China, so this clearly failed, right? So we know that this 200 billion purchase pledge is not happening, and so we also see that protectionism is not, or the decoupling is not a solution for the crisis. And so in this sense, yeah, so it will remain a challenge in terms of yeah, so how it means for for globalization and for yeah, so I think that's my take on that. But on the other hand, we have already seen that this is not, a decoupling or a renationalization of the production is not a solution to the current crisis. So that's.
Rüdi, your thoughts there on how this has affected things. I mean, I'm thinking even in terms of protectionism with regard to purchasing vaccines.
Sure. I mean, I agree with Lisandra that, and so with 2 points you really made. The first point is in terms of sort of limited, I mean, yes, we should be able to walk and chew gum, but in reality, that's just not the case, right? So there is something to that. And sort of there is limited attention for this, because at the end of the day, it has to it has to all come together. While there are many people, and Biden will appoint many capable of people to deal with different things domestically, internationally, and stuff. At the end of the day, it's still the buck stops with us at the top at some point. And so, the man has only 24 hours a day, has also only a 24-hour a day. And so, and it's pretty clear that COVID will trump, or the fight of COVID will trump everything in the first half year at least, and possibly longer. And then there are also domestic stimulus packages and stuff like that. So Marie is absolutely right with the deadline looming in TPA. I mean, that alone tells you, that we shouldn't really expect much immediate change, a substantive change in that. So trade is just going to be a third or fourth order policy priority right now. So with regards to your other question, I do think actually that that COVID and at least the exit polls, although exit polls need to be taken with a lot of salt, not just grains of salt, but with a lot of salt. But there was a surprising strength of sort of the Trump and the economy, right? And so, I mean, if you looked at sort of the polls before, it was always about sort of Biden is leading Trump on COVID response, the economy, and those who vote for Biden, they are very worried about COVID. And then Trump sort of was always leading the polls on sort of the economy. And it's true, whether you want to attribute this causally or not, I would rather not. But I think it is a fact that the United States economy sort of prior to February 2020 was in very good shape. Even in a sort of an inequality type of sense, right? We had seen growth in sort of real wages of low-income people. We had historic low unemployment rates for minorities. Okay, so there was. I mean, again, we can debate on how much this is Trump's contribution or despite Trump. But at the end of the day, who cares? Politically, this doesn't matter. Politically, what matters is the office holder that is in office when the economy is booming, and the economy was booming. And so Trump got a lot of clout with the American voter for the economy, and those who would vote for Trump said that the economy was important. Now, given that the overall, I mean, the polls in the end weren't quite as bad as we all thought, or some of us, or some people thought they were, sort of right on election day or 2 days later, given the blue catching up, right? The red mirage plus blue catching up, we kind of knew this was happening. So the polls kind of, the final result will be somewhat closer to the certainly nationally to the polls. But nevertheless, the polls did underestimate. There's no question that in the end, the polls underestimated Trump's success. And I do think this means that exit polls at least suggest that the economy was a bigger deal in voters' minds than and the ability to rebuild the economy after COVID was a bigger deal in people's minds than we thought. Okay, and I will say one more thing is that the Trump administration actually, and this is sort of I think less well reported in Europe, they get a lot of credit actually for Operation Warp Speed, right? It is at the end of yes, there was some help with some German startup company, BioNTech, but at the end of the day, it's sort of big US pharmaceutical companies who are sort of sort of pushing the vaccines. Sort of, I think in the US, we will on average get it faster than in Europe, the vaccine. And they're planning that. I think the Trump administration has gotten somewhat bipartisan credit on that, on Operation Warp Speed. Now there's a lot of issues. Can they? Did they really see it through? Now they probably don't have to, and maybe now because of spite. Trump is really a spiteful person. He might actually sort of try to prevent Biden from doing it quickly. But, sort of, it's not clear that they had sort of all the 100% steps in terms of rolling out distribution or logistics and stuff. That's less clear. But I mean, it is it's still a fact that that Trump will get some credit, and certainly in the eyes of some American voters will also get some credit for that, for an incredibly fast development and approval process for these vaccines. And, you know, Biden will hopefully be able to capitalize on that and maybe doing it even better than Trump would have done it. But nevertheless, Trump started the process. And so, and that, I think that's why the election was closer than we all thought. And I will speculate, you asked me to speculate, I will speculate that Trump probably would have won a second term without the COVID crisis.
Okay.
As sad as it is, as sad as an American, both in EU and American citizen, I have to admit that, but I think that's the naked truth.
Thank you. Now, I want to bring both Marie and Anna in on that as well, because that's the kind of, we're approaching the end, so that was kind of my wrap-up question. What was the impact of COVID? Also, if you want to reflect, as Rudy mentioned, on what damage Trump may be able to do in what time is left to him. Marie, I will let you go first, and then we'll come to Anna.
Okay, I will make sure to leave sufficient time for Anna. Really quick, 4 points. I think both Rudy and Lisandra talked about polls and numbers. So I think, and I think Anna mentioned that before, the pandemic has increased the negative view on China, both in the EU and in the US, which in the public, which is a huge point. I mean, there has been a huge spike in negative views on China, which, you know, gives both the EU and the US the political public support to be tough on China. So that is 1 point that the pandemic has brought about. Then I would say that the protectionist policies that we've been seeing and the tendencies have preceded the pandemic and have preceded Trump. They've been exacerbated by the pandemic and by Trump specifically in the US. However, we've seen the willingness to be more sovereign, more autark, to be independent. We've seen that before. It has been less outspoken. However, right now, everybody just uses COVID as kind of the excuse, for a lack of a better word, to disguise tendencies that have already been there before. On that, I think that my most important point is that most of the countries around the world have, as you said, employed protectionist measures such as subsidies in light of COVID, which was needed, you know, aid packages and so forth, for SMEs, for big companies, whatever. However, it is more important than ever in the aftermath of COVID, and, you know, looking towards that, to strengthen the WTO to deal with the aftermath of how do we roll back these measures, right? We understand that these measures were needed, but what if people take, or what if countries keep them in place once the crisis is over? So we will need to revamp our efforts of strengthening the WTO and reforming the WTO to really deal with what Rudy said with, you know, health-related issues such as collaborating on vaccines, but also on the aftermath of the current subsidies that countries have been employing in light of the pandemic. So I'll leave it at that and hand over to Anna.
So I also have essentially 4 points. Number one is that COVID and the way it unfolded in the United States really did totally reshape the 2020 election here. President Trump was running on, as Rudy said, his strong economy, and very quickly, you know, before the end of the spring, it was clear that he was realizing, and his advisors were realizing, that his ability to run on a strong economy was dramatically weakened by the economic fallout of the pandemic, and that he was going to need to pivot somehow and also to shift blame for the way that the COVID pandemic is playing out here to somebody else, and that somebody else was China. So it made China loom much larger in the election. China would have been an issue in the election regardless, but China ended up looming much, much larger in the election than it otherwise would have, I believe. And it also raised the stakes for both candidates to ensure that they had sufficiently tough China rhetoric. So I think that's resulted in Biden being a little bit more painted into a corner in terms of how he can come out of the gate in January and try to change our approach to China than he otherwise might have been. But then again, I have to agree with Rudy. I think that Biden's chances of winning the election had the pandemic not unfolded the way it did actually would have been lower. So, and then, I think in addition to the fact that it reshaped the election for the presidential candidates, it also created this huge sense of insecurity in Congress and among policymakers about supply chains and too much supply chain dependency on China in particular, but in general on any one nation, and lack of diversification in supply chains and the need to reshore all sorts of critical goods, critical being an undefined term that could capture almost anything, and certainly in policy proposals right now captures everything from personal protective equipment and pharmaceuticals to silicon chips and other high-tech items and rare earths, minerals, and even aluminum, which has been exacerbated by the fact that there actually is enough of an aluminum shortage in the United States during the pandemic that you can't buy all of the sodas that you would normally buy at the grocery store. I guess that the third point is that absolutely it increased negative perceptions of China in the United States and, as Marie mentioned, and the EU as well, which is an interesting development because it really could have been an opportunity for China to assert itself in a positive way on the international stage, to provide support, to provide advice, and to provide equipment. But unfortunately, there were too many incidents where the equipment that it provided was faulty, and then, coupled with some wolf warrior diplomacy, as it's termed over here, with Australia and other countries that made it look like a bad actor. So China really lost an opportunity and then created an opportunity for the United States and the European Union to come together a little bit more in agreement on addressing China challenges. Unfortunately, the US wasn't a much better actor in its international engagement throughout this pandemic. And I think, by pulling out of the WHO and refusing to participate in vaccine developments with other WHO members and kind of underscoring the Trump administration's America First unilateralism, the United States didn't put itself in a great position. But Biden has been clear and was clear on the campaign trail that he intends to put us right back in the WHO, to get us re-engaged and get our money recommitted there and elsewhere. So I think there may be a chance here for diplomatic wins all the way around, because not only can Biden reassert United States goodwill and engagement in these international institutions to help us all come through the pandemic successfully, but also one of the things that Trump got rid of when he started running China policy in this new direction was all of the different dialogues and cooperative mechanisms that the United States and China had, including on things like infectious diseases and climate change. And Biden, I think, is going to reinstate those. So there's an opportunity here for US-EU relations, for US-China relations, and for international relations. And it may also be an opportunity to discuss disciplines for subsidies at the WTO. I agree with Marie on that.
Thank you very much, Anna. And indeed, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this great discussion. Well, it was certainly absolutely fascinating. I'm sure we could probably have continued for some while longer. Thank you also to the previous speakers and to the attendees, participants, some of whom have been with us since 9 o'clock this morning, still asking questions, still remaining engaged. So that is very much appreciated. Remember, if you want to continue on the conversation online, you can use the hashtag EconPaul2020. We also have the Wonder app, mechanism, program, whatever you want to call it, continuing after we finish up, so you can go and meet other attendees. And of course, although the pandemic has set us back in some ways, it has allowed us to maybe get more people from around the world. Some of you might not have been able to join in person. So we'll try to find the silver lining in all of that. Thank you all very much. I'm going to hand over for our closing remarks now to Clemens First, President of IFO Institute and Econ Pol Europe. Clemens, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you. Thanks to all panel members. This was really fascinating. I have to say I really revised some of my views on what's going on here. Particularly interesting, I found Rüdiger's call on the EU to do something for more multilateralism. But overall, really very interesting insights. Now, the conference is coming to an end here. We have 2 exciting days behind us. We started yesterday with a keynote by EU Budget Commissioner Johannes Hahn. We discussed the budget, which is in difficult negotiations, as we all know. We discussed the rule of law, but also questions like how do we make sure that all this money that is being piled up here is actually used in a meaningful way. We then had a panel discussion where what struck me most, as you may remember, where we had a German Secretary of State who, when asked what came out of the Corona crisis for him, who said, we are getting more fiscal integration in Europe, and that's a good thing. So if we compare this to the discussions we had in the financial crisis 10 years ago, we can only say times are changing, and maybe that's a good thing. So I've really enjoyed this conference, and I hope that applies to you too. I've learned a lot, and I would like to thank all who have made this possible. So thanks to all speakers on this panel, on the previous panels. Thanks to all participants and all those who have worked very hard to put the program together and provided technical support, including Matthias Dolz, Cornelia Geisler, Juliet Shaw, and the CES-IFO conference team. I would also like to thank Jennifer Baker, of course. Jennifer, thank you for this brilliant moderation of today's panel. Yesterday, we had Monica Jones. Thanks to her as well. And I would like to conclude with a short outlook on our next event, which is coming soon, next Thursday to be precise. And there we will have a presentation by the European Fiscal Board about its report with discussants from the Econ Pol network, but also with Thomas Westphal from the German Ministry of Finance and Agnès Benassi from the French Ministry of Finance. So again, thanks to all of you for your contributions. Enjoy the rest of the day. I hope in particular our American friends will enjoy their well-deserved turkey and relax, with this outlook on a new presidency and a new beginning. You, Rudi, of course, also, I consider you our American-German friend. Are you doing turkey today? I hope so, Rudi.
Absolutely not. It's the most hideous fowl you could possibly imagine. No, it's going to be duck.
Oh, it's going to be duck. Okay, great.
Is it not chlorinated chicken?
Good. Okay, that reveals my ignorance. But on this note, thank you again. Enjoy the rest of the day, and goodbye.